Good morning or good afternoon. My name is David Weil, and I'm the Dean of the Heller School for Social Policy and Management. And I am delighted to welcome you all today to our event marking the life and the continuing work of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I'm pleased to see so many from our Heller and Brandeis community have joined us for this event. And I'm particularly happy to welcome all who are currently participating in our Heller Pro Seminar on Racial Justice and/or participating in the 21-day Racial Equity Habit Building Challenge. More is going to be said about this shortly. All of us at the Heller School and at Brandeis University are fortunate to have as our colleague, Professor Anita Hill. Professor Hill is the University Professor of Social Policy, Law, and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies here at Brandeis and at the Heller School. Professor Hill is a renowned scholar and public figure on race and gender discrimination and on the struggle for equality and women's rights. Her work has profoundly impacted scholarship and policy in many realms, including most recently chairing the Hollywood Commission on Eliminating Sexual Harassment and Advancing Equality. Among her many awards and honorary degrees, she was named in 2020 as one of Time's 100 prominent women of the past 100 years. Her insights into law, equality, and the Supreme Court make her uniquely qualified to discuss the topic of today's event: the future of equality and the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, I have had the good fortune to have an ongoing discussion with Professor Hill on the legal context of equality as it plays out in the workplace. Old and new business models have undermined the most basic worker rights, like receiving a minimum wage or overtime, as well as protections against sexual harassment or discrimination, by classifying workers as independent contractors and through a number of other changes that have occurred. A disproportionate percentage of this erosion has affected Black and workers of color, and this has been made strikingly clear by the impacts of the pandemic. Though we have faced an erosion of rights and protections in the workplace during the Trump administration, that erosion began decades earlier and includes decisions taken by the courts. To our topic today, workers have been profoundly impacted by Supreme Court decisions regarding union representation and the rights of workers to bring class action lawsuits, among many other decisions. These questions have been and will continue to play out in our judicial system and affect our notions of equality. Today's event is hosted by the Heller School for Social Policy and Management and will be facilitated by my two colleagues, Associate Dean for Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity, and the Director of the Institute for Assets and Social Policy, Dr. Maria Madison, and by Associate Dean for Research and Professor in the Schneider Institutes for Health Policy and Research, Cindy Thomas. Cindy, you want to get us started?
Thank you, Dean Weil. I want to welcome again the Heller community, and it's great to see you all, and thanks again to Professor Hill for sharing some of her wisdom with us today. Program is part of our Pro Seminar on Social Justice. This is our first year at the Heller School, and we plan to inaugurate it for all students eventually. A special welcome to our winter session students. Just to start with a few notes on the session. Questions have been submitted by Heller students in advance. Our goal is to gain insight into what equality means in its fullest sense in these times and the role of the Supreme Court. This session's being recorded, and within a few days you can access it on the Heller News website or on the Alumni Events website. Chat today is disabled, and let's now turn to Professor Hill to frame the topic. Anita, you're on mute.
Oh, I unmuted, and am I unmuted now? Great. Thanks, Cindy. I'm not sure I've ever heard you call me Professor Hill, but I actually today, I hope that we're all going to be on first name basis, because the topics that we're talking about today really are, I believe, universal topics, but they're also very personal topics for most of us. And so I wrote down a few words about what I think the day and the totality of the experience that we're in, the social and political and economic and health and safety period that we're existing in right now. And I'd just like to read them, or at least go over very carefully what my notes are saying. You know, it is, we are looking forward in the next 48 hours to a historic event. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will make history. Kamala Harris, in particular, as the first African American, Indian American vice president of the United States of America. And this is something to celebrate. I'm hoping that we can all celebrate that, not just people of color, not just women, but the entire community of us. A theme of this inaugural address is going to be unity, bringing the country together. And one of the, to me, one of the things that the ticket of the vice president and the president reflect is a sort of unity by bringing in a more inclusive government to really take care of the world's problems for the next 4 years. But it's important to say up front that this political moment and the call for unity begs for greater attention to inequalities. And I'm concerned that with the pushback that we're getting, that there will be some resistance to that idea that inequality should be at the forefront of the considerations for this administration. You know, over the summer, with what I call US COVID, with the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement, and then the rise of domestic terrorism, we struggled with the question of what equality in this country meant and whether it mattered and how much it mattered. And we've talked in different forums about inequality and COVID. We've talked at different forums about inequality and Black Lives Matter. But I think it's important for us to think about what the rise of domestic terrorism has to say about the issues of inequality in this country. If you had a chance, and I hope you, if you haven't, you will read it, on the Brandeis Now website or page is a Q&A with Janet McIntosh, who is a faculty member at Brandeis in communications. And she talks about the basis of the insurrection over the election results in this Q&A. And in some, what she says is that white nationalists' sense of aggrieved entitlement culminated basically in this Stop the Steal campaign. And you heard Stop the Steal over and over when it came to the election results. Stop the steal of this election. The implications for that were that Black voters were electing a president in cities like Atlanta, in cities like Philadelphia, in cities in the Northeast, in Detroit. And that somehow, because there was so much interest in and such a high turnout of Black voters, that the election itself might be delegitimized. This kind of thinking isn't limited. The Stop the Steal thinking isn't limited to voting rights or elections. Stop the Steal has actually become a catchphrase for a whole range of equality topics that we have explored over the years. But the new rhetoric coming out of the Trump administration and out of some white nationalist groups, as well as other far-right groups, has made it, given it a certain permanence, and actually pushed movements like what we saw ended up in the insurrection at the Capitol. What the crux of their argument is that Blacks, immigrants, all people who are claiming greater rights, including women, have taken over and are taking things away from white males. They're stealing elections, they're stealing jobs, they're stealing housing, education, healthcare, etc., in the name of equality. What is missing in the discussion that is on the website, though, is that something that the Anti-Defamation League reported on in 2018. And in short, these same movements that are anti-racial and ethnic equality are also threatened by white women and all women's search for equality. So what we have now in this moment as we think about equality is not only that we think about equality in a very traditional and narrow sense, but we have this opportunity to really think about how the anti-equality movement has tainted our political system and is moving a substantial number of supporters of at least Donald Trump, and we'll see who in the future, to push back in violent ways on many fronts in terms of what the political agenda of this country will be. We have to be sure, as people who are here at Heller, as policymakers, as social scientists who are doing research, we need to be quite sure that when it comes to equality, that we are prioritizing it and that we are using our skills and resources to support it, that we look at equality and think about equality on the basis of across different platforms, including human rights, constitutional law, civil rights law, labor law, as David has mentioned, environmental law, as well as criminal law. And we've got to really start thinking about equality in terms of an integrated concept of equality. We also have to think about equality at the different levels. It's not just the judiciary that's going to decide what equality means. The executive branch has a role, as well as the legislative branch. And then finally, we've got to start thinking about it in terms of state law, federal law, and even local laws. And so what I'm hoping that we will leave thinking about today is really equality across many identities, equality across many platforms, across the different venues for enforcing it and articulating it, and that we will leave thinking more creatively about our roles as policymakers and policy influencers.
Thank you so much, Professor Hill, Anita. We, as you know, solicited questions from our students in advance and collected about 4 questions, particularly probing the issue and role of the US Supreme Court. So I'm gonna ask you the first of those questions, which is particularly related to the fact that our students come from around the world. They are looking for a bit of a greater description of the process and structure of the US Supreme Court, and related to that, whether the US Supreme Court should be expanded. Some would even say maybe consider disbanding it, and how that is related to equality.
Well, it's interesting. That's an interesting question. It's one that's been discussed a lot, especially in terms of the expansion of the court. And perhaps it's one of those things that is kind of at the intersection of judicial process and politics. And unfortunately, most of the discussion has been around the politics of it. I'd like us to sort of step back and just think about what it would mean to expand the court. It might be, and where I come out is thinking, well, it might be a great idea for Joe Biden to expand the court and to be able to put on additional bodies. And in that sense, it would be a good idea, if not to tip the scale to our liberal leaning court, to at least balance the court. It's something that we've always talked about. It's having balanced representation in terms of different ideologies and different jurisprudences. That part, I agree, is good. But what I am concerned about, frankly, is suppose there is a re-election in 2024 of a Donald Trump. And how do we really manage it if just a large number of judges that we prefer retire? And so, I'm not sure that expanding the court is a good idea. There has also been some ways, we have 9 members of the court. It's been that way really in all of modern history. I don't really have the date that the court expanded to 9 members, but it's an odd number so that you can have a majority. I'm concerned about expanding the court because, there are different, even liberal, whether liberal or conservative, there are different ways and philosophies of getting to outcomes. I think that you could end up with a whole lot of plurality decisions as opposed to majority decisions. And I think it would be almost impossible with an expanded court to get a unanimous decision on any particular case. And those really have unanimous decisions. For example, in the case of Brown versus the Board of Education, was really crucial to moving toward greater equality, racial equality in this country. And so I think that there are some pros and cons to this, but where I land is, I think we should be spending more time thinking about the process of getting the 9 people on the court who are, which makes up the body right now, as opposed to expanding the group.
Thank you. And I think another student's question sort of builds on the answer you've provided, which is, will President Trump's Supreme Court choices actually change much about how the court rules?
Oh, absolutely. I think there will be clearly a change. I mean, we do know now that we have a right-leaning, a conservative-leaning Supreme Court. And that we'll see exactly how that begins to play out. And this is one of the years where there are not a whole slew of equality cases on the court's docket. There are some that I'll mention later, but this is not one where it's loaded with these cases. There have been some challenges to the way that we actually got to this majority right-leaning court, and that has to do with the Federalist Society and their role in providing and the names for judicial nominees throughout the system, but particularly on the Supreme Court. Last year, there was a proposed ethics ban in the judicial, from a judicial advisory committee, a proposed ban to keep judges from being active members of groups like the Federalist Society, and a counterpart on the liberal side, the American Constitution Society. It was promoted, it was put out there for public discussion, and the Federalist Society objected to it, which to me really shows their outsized influence on the judiciary. But I think what we really need to be doing is thinking, now the question is that, yeah, we are going to have a conservative court for some time now, unless perhaps, people change their minds and their thinking, but this doesn't seem to be the case. And we are not going to be able to change that unless there are retirements or people leave the court for whatever reason, people die. And so I think what we have to also think about is that if we are not in this moment going to be able to take the politics out of the selection process. It's not going to happen. I think, and I'm not even sure we really want to, because the court is so left-leaning, strongly left-leaning now. There's no central. Do we want politics to be removed at this point? Are we, if we say, okay, well, let's now start to build a court that is center, you're still going to have a pull toward conservatism. So is that what we want to do? I think there's a lot of thinking that needs to go into this. So, and I don't think we're there yet. And that's kind of the political scientist part of it that I think we need to have somebody else in the conversation before we reach that conclusion.
Thank you. Cindy, do you want to go ahead or?
Yeah, Anita, there's a lot of interest in understanding among our students in understanding immigration and other community concerns, environmental, detention, hate crimes, et cetera, housing. What is the continued role of the Supreme Court in immigrants and other residents' rights?
Yeah, let me just say that when we have a court such as this one that is clearly leaning toward conservative heavily, and in some places we have judicial, we have members of the court, we have Supreme Court justices who have in some cases been described as sort of being on the fringe in terms of conservatism, not even central in conservatism, that we can expect that there will be a continued narrowing of protections when it comes to these communities, whether it's immigration or immigrant communities or communities of color or economics, or the specific topics, whether it's employment law, labor law. What we are going to see is a narrowing of the concept of what equality actually even means. And that's going to play out in a number of different ways. We've had a couple of surprises in this term about equality. We had the Bostock versus Clayton case that expanded civil rights protections to cover LGBTQ folks, and in particular, there were trans people involved. And so that was really a landmark case. But you can expect that even though the categories of coverage may have expanded, What there will be shrinking of is some of the protections of workers in particular. So you're going to see fewer class action cases. You're going to be seeing real strong enforcement of restrictions on class action suits. And class action suits are important because they can allow really much more systemic change in workforces across industries. You will see upholding things like non-disclosure agreements, forced arbitration. I'm really concerned about, not for arbitration that's, that is negotiated by a union, but forced on employees by their employers. You're going to see limitations in what kind of legislation can be adopted. And all of these things are important, I think, for us when we start thinking about policy, because there's some of these pushbacks on, for example, upholding non-disclosure agreements that are happening at the state level with state laws banning them in terms of their applications to equality cases. You may start to see some more pushback at the state level on forced arbitration. So there's sort of movement around. I like to put emphasis on what the court says, but in many ways, I think we have to remember that the court typically do not interfere. They're not. They're reactive, I should be saying. They're reactive. They react to what is brought to them. So we need to be thinking about what are we going to be bringing to the courts in terms of policies that are more progressive? What are we going to be bringing to them as advocates and lawyers in terms of litigation strategies that will be protecting groups like immigrant groups? And so, we've talked about DACA. For now, DACA is being protected, but DACA there are many elements to DACA's protection that go beyond the recognition of a group of individuals who were born in this country and their right to citizenship. So, for example, right now, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights is involved in a nationwide class action lawsuit on behalf of DACA recipients who have been denied financing for their student loans. It's a topic that's really important for those DACA students who are trying to be here, not only just to exist here, but want to be able to get an education here and want to be able to take out a student loan and not be discriminated against on the basis of their immigration status as DACA individuals who are beneficiaries of DACA. There are other kinds of immigrant community suits going on as well. Suits about that really come down to climate justice and environmental justice. The Lawyers Committee is involved with those kinds of lawsuits that are critical. We're not just talking about the right to be here, but what kind of conditions do we live in once we are in our communities, once everybody is here? Does immigration status or the fact that your community is predominantly immigrant community then mean that you are not going to have the full benefits that other communities have? And so I think we need to really start thinking about DACA very clearly, but we also need to be thinking more robustly about what does equality actually mean on a day-to-day basis. And some of these suits are starting to do that.
Great, thank you. And thank you for reminding us about this nexus between politics, policy, and the courts. I think that's really important to get us thinking more broadly. Maria, did you have some?
Thank you, Cindy. Anita, we have a couple of additional questions from students. I'm going to bundle them together and we'll sort of disaggregate them as we go, but they fundamentally are around what court cases do you see coming before the courts in the near future? And the first category are what cases related to race and policing, for example, do you see coming forth, and how that relates to the potential for creating an equitable society?
Yeah, you know, I'm not seeing on the docket this year, at least, much around policing. And in part, I think it's because the Trump administration has sort of made it clear that the Trump Justice Department, and it was the Trump Justice Department, was not pursuing the policing agenda in the same way that it had been pursued when Eric Holder was the Attorney General. And so I think it's time for the policymakers in the Justice Department to do away with the thinking that was prevalent in the Trump administration. And to start again to look at policing in the country, and we'll start to see those cases coming up again. But I would also say that we need to start thinking more about different ways of policing and different locations for policing. So, for example, I think of, sort of race and gender and policing all together. And one of the things that we do know that needs greater attention is policing in our schools, whether it is the presence of armed police in our schools or the way that children are being policed by the school systems. We have a whole, stack of evidence, if you will, on how Black girls in particular are over-policed in school systems, whether it is through detention policies or dress codes. We know this exists. That's a form of policing that we haven't had enough conversations about. We also know that LGBTQ youth are policed differently, more harshly, in putting them in the criminal justice system in terms of the juvenile justice system, and then sort of setting them up for a path that will ultimately lead to adult incarceration. We know that policing, for example, now is increasing on women of color. The number of women of color being incarcerated now is increasing, and in some cases it's outpacing the number of men of color in terms of representation in the population, in the prison population. And the impacts on policing on women and incarceration of women are perhaps broader in many cases than in incarceration of people who identify as men. But so there are a whole range of policing issues that we're not dealing with. There was a conference this summer called the Survivors Conference, and it was one of the first ever, I believe, national conferences for survivors of sexual assault and violence, including intimate partner violence and street violence. And what we found from that conference is that many times when individuals who are victims go to the police, a couple of things happen. One, their cases are dismissed in huge number. And the other thing that's happening is that they end up feeling like the system criminalizes them. Now, there's some resistance to even going to the police, and part of the resistance is, the prisons are already too full, and we understand that in our community. But the other resistance is because the police system for treating rape and sexual assault has not been survivor and victim oriented in any way. And the harshest expressions of that really falls on women of color and poor women in communities where sometimes their cases don't even show up as being reported. So I think we need to start thinking about policing in a variety of ways. And we need to think of it through a racial lens, but a race and gender lens as well. And sexual identity. All of those things are compounding to creating a whole different prison population and actually feeding the system that we're already complaining about being overfed.
Thank you. When you think about the transition in the administrations, President Trump's administration and the Biden-Harris administration, where do you see the momentum coming from for the movement and support for these court cases related to race, policing, gender, sexual orientation? Where will that be coming from?
Well, there are going to be a lot of groups that have been our advocacy groups, and it is interesting. A lot of the groups, like the LDF, NAAC Legal Defense Fund, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, ADL, the ACLU, a lot of these groups have been litigation oriented. And they will continue to do litigation and make cases, argue cases in court. But they're also now increasingly organizations that are trying to influence policy. So there's not that bright line between what's happening in the courts and then what's happening to influence policy as there was historically in the historic civil rights movement. So one of the organizations that I'm involved with is the National Women's Law Center. And there is this movement now to understand that some of the work that we want done has to be negotiated with policy folks on Capitol Hill. And so, it really does, in fact, make politics important, because who's in the majority in these two houses can make a world of difference. And we've seen that being borne out in terms of the Georgia election. One election in one state has the potential for influencing policy for the next 4 years at least, and maybe longer if we sort of, but it could also be only for the next 2 years because things could shift. So I think I'm seeing these influences coming from different places than what we traditionally thought. We sort of thought that, oh, well, the people who are lawyers, they do court. and there's somebody else is doing policy. And what we're seeing really is an overlap, which again, I think makes our work so important. Because the understanding of how those two things can overlap and the kinds of information that the litigators are going to need, not only for their litigation in terms of social science information, it is the kind of information that they're going to need is information that people from Heller can provide, because it's what we're trained to do. So but we also need to know how courts work, because ultimately the Supreme Court may be deciding the case, the legitimacy of whatever policy is adopted. And so to strengthen those, I think we've got to work together, both as policy influencers and drafters, and as well as litigators.
Thank you. And one last probe before we move into closing remarks, to follow along the overall objective toward unity. We are seeing and have seen, particularly in the last week, how strikingly divided the country is. Do you see or how would you characterize the kinds of barriers the new administration, maybe even the courts, will be facing, given that half the country, or seemingly almost half the country, is divided?
I mean, it does seem like it's split. I don't know that it's evenly split. I think that we've got a very, very vocal and violent minority, and we've seen them in operation. So I think there has to be a handle on understanding, where are the divisions? I don't think there's enough information on that. I mean, I think there's some clear understanding of where a certain segment stands. They've made it very clear. They've been very vocal about it. But I don't know that there has been enough adequate information on whether or not there are places where interests coincide and some movement can be made. And so I think that's one of the things that has to happen. And I don't know what that process is. To me, that really is the political process. But I do see a real possibility of that taking place. And I think that it's going to be the only thing that's going to actually give us a sense of movement that is sustainable.
Thank you so much. Cindy, do you have any other questions?
Well, just one small thing to turn back to. You mentioned gender equality, and I'm wondering what you think the outlook is for women's rights and women's health in particular over the next few months in the court.
Well, if the Affordable Care Act isn't upheld in the next few years, I mean, there are health issues that are going to affect women. Preconditioning, I mean, even something as basic as women who will not perhaps be covered because they have been victims of intimate partner violence. With the concern about being able to get an abortion will come up again, and we have a court that I'm sure right now, if you looked at the majority and they had the right case, that they would chip away quite extensively at the right for access to abortion. I think that there are some other gender issues as well that we've had the Boston ruling that we sort of went in favor of LGBTQ folks, but we also have a case that is on the docket of the Supreme Court. It's Philadelphia versus City of Philadelphia versus Fulton, that involves same-sex couples in their right to be parts of the foster system. So I think there are some gender issues that are out there. And quite frankly, as a policy issue, my concern is about the enormous amount of gender-based violence that appears throughout our society at all age level, across all classes, across whether you're talking about racial classifications or economic classes, all locations. I mean, COVID has sort of exposed it. Our shelters are full now, more full than ever. They're overrunning because of people basically being trapped in homes where they're being abused, and now because of COVID, and now moving into shelters. And we don't have to look any farther than our militaries. I mean, if you look at what's happened at Fort Hood over the last few months, and our militaries officers keep promising us that they're going to do better, and then there's another scandal that comes up and nothing has changed. I see that as something that really is a policy issue that needs to be addressed, that needs to be changed. And the reason that I believe that it's not going to be settled by the court is because in many ways, the avenue for addressing them, the Violence Against Women Act, has been gutted in much the same way that Voting Rights Acts have been gutted. The Voting Rights Act has been gutted. So I see some real challenges to our rights as women, some basic things like being safe in our homes and in our institutions, in our militaries, and our workplaces. So I'm optimistic in that I know that there is a movement, but we are so far behind in capitalizing on that movement. And then finally, I did mention Voting Rights Act. There is a case on voting rights, on the Voting Rights Act, about what kind of challenges can be brought under the Voting Rights Act. That's on the docket. It's based in Arizona. I think you're going to, I don't know how that decision is going to go. I mean, it's a fairly technical case about people who vote out of precinct, and whether or not all of their votes could be invalidated. Even a vote on sort of a national election would be invalidated because they vote out of precinct. And so there are some things out there that are coming up that give me pause. But back to the gender issue, I think there is this very important gender issue that we are missing when it comes to voting, that this year's election should have brought to our attention, because of so many in the minority communities of people who are voting are women versus men. And we should be asking two questions. What then does that say about whether women are getting full representation for their vote? And secondly, is it enough to have a woman of color as vice president, for example? Is there more that we need? And secondly, why aren't more men voting? And is it because of incarceration in the prison system that we have that keeps them from voting after they've served their time? and certainly keeps them from voting while they're serving their time. So, you know, I see a gender issue there that's expressing itself to disadvantage both genders and in different ways. So there's a lot, I have a lot on my mind. And so I'll just
thank you.
You
thank you. And you remind us of how much work we have to do at Heller on the policy side.
Yeah.
Maria? Go ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Maria.
No, I was just going to say thank you so much. This is immense, and trying to follow up, especially in the next 2 years, to see that kind of vision you raised for us around the intersection of voting rights, women's rights, and the alienation of men, or the absence of men. We have a lot of work to do in the next 2 years. All of those certainly pointing to equality and the relationship with the courts. Would you like to move forward with your closing remarks to sum all that up?
I can't sum it all up. I can't, but I can say it. Maybe this is the summation that I would give, is that I know, or I hope, I know you've got your pro-seminar people there, and I'm hoping that there are other Heller students and graduates out there who are as concerned about the issues and are inspired by the times that we're in. You know, inspiration comes from some positive things. It can come from negative things as well. Inspiration to do problem solving is important. We have an opportunity. It's just a window of opening for the next 2 years, let's just say, to think creatively and expansively about what equality means. We don't need to put ourselves on the same agenda as some of the people who are critics of equality. We need to address them as part of being in a democracy, but we shouldn't let their ideas drive it. And that's true whether they are conservative people on the court or conservative people in the streets rioting. And so I'm hoping that when we think about equality, we are going to think about it in a 21st century way. We're going to use what we know about collecting information and using data and understanding the intersections of not only the different platforms for getting to equality, but also the different people who are the beneficiaries of our efforts. And I'm hoping that this will start a new conversation and give us all something to look forward to as we celebrate Martin Luther King, as well as this new administration.
That's absolutely beautiful. A call to a new conversation, and vis-a-vis and in face of all the events in the last week, the events in the last year, the events since the 60s civil rights movement and today's MLK, remembrance reminds us of, as well as the hundreds of years of inequity. You are providing a call for a new conversation, as well as to be inspired by the times we are in, and to look at that adversity in a sense of strength, and to capitalize on that. That's absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm going to just remind the students that are on this class, thank you all for participating for the 21-day challenge, participants in particular. We will be debriefing after this with a separate link that you should have in your emails, and that we'll also be posting this video recording on the web the Heller website, so you can listen and think about these issues and the challenge, if you will, that Professor Hill raised for us. And I'll just quote again: inspired by the times we are in, creating this window of opportunity to think creatively and expansively about equality and your role in creating that, especially in Cindy's reminder, since we're a school of public policy, how are you personally going to embrace that, embrace the evidence, and use that for an evidence-based transformation? So thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Professor Hill. Thank you, Dean Weil and Joanne, and our tech assistants, Menon, and our captioner, Nicole. I just want to say thank you to everyone, and Professor Hill or Cindy, I don't know if you want to.
And thank you, Maria, as well, for helping organize this.
Right, and thanks both of you for your questions and the time and energy and thought that you put into it, and that you have forced me to put into it.
And we turn back to the students because it's all about them. So thank you.
Thank you.